Thanks for listening. If you'd like to schedule a one-on-one coaching with Dr. Lodhi, please visit drsadaf.com. I am an American board certified OBGYN, a mom, a Muslim, and I'm talking about sex. This is the Muslim Sex Podcast. Welcome to the Muslim Sex Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Sadaf Lodhi, and this episode is everything you need to know about managing anxiety in a relationship. Before I get into it, the first thing I want to make very clear is that I'm not giving any type of medical advice. So if you have any concerns at all about your health, please speak with your healthcare provider. And if you have any questions about your religion, please see your neighborhood religious leader. It's the Muslim Sex Podcast because I just happen to be a Muslim woman who talks about sex. So welcome again, Dr. Ahsan Shaikh. So glad to have you on and continue our talk about anxiety and how anxiety shows up in a relationship. And now we're going to get to the good stuff of how to manage anxiety and what you can do. So welcome back.
Thank you. It's great to be back, Sadaf, and hope you're doing well. And wishing all your viewers a happy New Year. New Year's often a good time to kind of think about trying new things. And since anxiety is such a common feature of everybody's life, we've talked about how it's actually an important part of our body's protective system to have anxiety, to have sort of this adrenaline pumping through your body to protect you. This will be a good time to kind of think of ways to manage it and come up with some new ideas for the year. So that's what I was hoping to do today. And one way to kind of just start the conversation is just a reminder that again, what we call "quote unquote" anxiety really is our limbic brain or our survival brain's sworn duty to protect us. That's really what it's trying to do. It's trying to protect us at all times. And in doing so, it tries to do two things. It tries to detect threats to us, and it tries to mobilize us to meet these threats. Really at the basic level. That's what it's trying to do.
Sure.
And so one of the ways to kind of manage stress is to recognize that it's not doing anything dangerous, but it's got sort of this agenda. And the agenda is to kind of speed us up and to make quick decisions, because it's assuming that the threat that we're under is an immediate threat, not like most of our threats. Hopefully, most of the threats that we're all going through in our lives are not immediate dangers. Hopefully, they're more what I call existential threats, like how am I going to do in my relationship? How am I going to do at my job? Right? Those types of things. But because that's not really the way our system is designed, it tends to speed us up. So these techniques, I think, will help slow us down so that we can be our best selves, and that we can be our best selves for our partners too. So the first concept I wanted to try to introduce was this idea of stress and control. So, for example, if you think about what your mind does, even without you asking it to do, is that it constantly keeps thinking about what could go wrong, right? That it's not doing that to make us miserable. It's trying to do that to sort of like protect us. And let's think of the things that matter to us and could go wrong in three categories. And it's actually helpful to think of this visually. So imagine you're in the center of a circle, and the circle around you, first of all, are things that you worry about that are actually fully in your control, 100% in your control. So an example would be, all right, my intention today is going to be to be kind to my partner. That intention is fully in your control. Okay, so that's that first area. That's an example of one. Now, beyond that area, though, our mind also looks at things that are only partially in our control. Imagine that as like this ring around that middle circle. So that would be like, for example, whether people like us. If you think about that, that's partially in our control. It's not fully. I say partially because we be kind, we can be caring, attentive, right? And that helps. So it does matter, right? But it's not fully in our control because there's another person and they have their own ideas and agendas and needs and etc. So partial control. So that's the second area. And then beyond that, there's still things our mind worries about that it actually has no control over, right? And just the fact that it has no control doesn't stop our mind from thinking about it. And
Yeah.
ironically, the less control our mind has over something, the more it thinks about it,
Hmm.
right? Not less, the more it thinks about it. If you think of really what our mind is trying to do, it's trying to solve a problem. And if the problem is actually within our control, we can kind of just get to it and solve it. So if I'm worried, like, oh, shoot, I've really got to do my bills, that's in my control. It can motivate me. It's a good thing. It gets me out of my chair into the office doing my bills, and then it's done, and then the worry goes away. So that's useful kind of anxiety, useful worry. But if it's something that's like only partially or fully out of my control, my mind just keeps trying to solve it again and again. And this is where, if you've heard of the term rumination, right? People ruminate. This often happens late at night, when we're trying to go to sleep.
Yeah.
Our mind tries to solve this unsolvable problem. So recognizing so that's an example of what happens, and we'll talk about how to deal with that. But the first thing I ask people to do is, spend about like a week and just, actually write this out on a piece of paper, these three circles, and just notice, where do most of your worries lie? Is it in the middle, things you can control? Is it in the partial control kind of ring? Or are you actually spending most of your time worrying about things that you absolutely have no control over? So that's like step one. Get an assessment of what naturally happens for you. Okay. Now, let's take them one at a time. What's this? Because there's different strategies for each. So, what's the best strategy for the stuff that's within our full control? Well, it's to do it as quickly as you can. Why? Because if you hold off on it, if you procrastinate something that you actually could do, the entire time that you could be doing it, your brain is going to be revving and sending adrenaline into your system, sending worry into your mind because you've not completed it, right? And a really neat analogy to this is what animals do. Okay, so for example, let's take two species, cows and buffaloes. And when a storm comes, so it's really interesting in the United States, storms, there have been a lot of storms here in California. Storms always come from the west and they head east. When a cow senses a storm coming, they don't like it, they don't want to get rained on, so they try to run away from it. They head east too. But they're cows, so they're really slow. So they head east and the storm catches them. And because they're heading in the same direction as the storm, they get rained on more, longer than had they just even stood still. Okay. Now, buffaloes, on the other hand, are very aggressive animals. And when they sense a danger, they actually charge into it. So if a storm comes, they head into the storm. So the interesting thing is that they get rained on less because they're opposite directions. And that's very similar to like procrastination, where if we try to run away from something that we could just do and finish, we're like the cow. We get rained on all day. Our mind keeps worrying and worrying and worrying, and we end up spending like 8 hours of stress rather than 15 minutes if we were more like the buffalo in charge. And so it's a mindset. It's sort of fight over flight. When you get that unpleasant feeling like, ugh, I got to do something, kind of get angry with it and say, I'm sick of this on my back, and just get it done. And then you'll feel the reward of that. As you get into a habit of that, you'll feel this nice kind of relief that, yes, I'm getting my stuff done early. And then I have time later in the day to actually truly relax, guilt free. So that's that first area. Um, Now, I'm going to come to the second area last, that partial control, because that's actually the hardest one. Let's go to the area of no control. And I don't know, so to put you on the spot, give me an idea of something you stress about that logically you just know you don't have actually any control over.
Yeah. If it's going to rain when I want to go out.
There you go. There you go. Absolutely. Zero control. You can wish it not to rain. You can want it not to rain, but it's going to rain or it's not going to rain, right? And at the best, we get a forecast about that. So the best thing for things that are beyond our control is to learn how to let go of the need to control those things. We can wish all we want, right? And taking that like to a more serious note, there are things that we want to happen in our lives. There are people who pass away. There are wars. There are horrible things that happen that we really don't want to happen. We have no control over, right? And that's really where like a philosophy is important, right? A sense of spirituality, religiosity, philosophy, however you want to describe it, right? I think everyone comes to this at some phase in their life. They're faced with this like need to have just a way of thinking of that. Like, I'm a human being. I can only exert so much control. There's things I have to let go of. And a lot of people will say, okay, well, I'll let God take care of that, right? Or people who are not religious will say, I can only do what I can do. I can only sort of, you know, marshal my resources for the things I actually have control over. So there's a lot of different ways, but it's important to develop a sort of, like I say, like a philosophy about letting go. And a lot of successful people have a very hard time letting go because they're by nature what's got them to their success is their tenacity, right? Their stick to itiveness. They want to be able to solve every problem, right? That's gotten them far in their lives. So to let go of things kind of goes against the grain for them. But like any skill, it's a mental skill. And in a lot of Eastern cultures, they talk a lot about attachment and letting go of attachments and the process of doing that. And that involves, some mindfulness, the ability to kind of see that a thought is just a thought. It's something created in our mind. It's not a reality. We can choose to do what we would like to do with it. But so yeah, letting go of things that we don't control is at the heart of so many different philosophies, and is the important thing in that sector. Now, the final sector, though, is probably what I think our mind tends to worry about the most. Like, if just in my experience, what most people worry about are not things that they don't have any control of. They kind of have developed that philosophy,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
they kind of get to the things that they actually do have control of. But what they really struggle with are things that they have partial control of. And because they have partial control, they desire to, there's this wish that they can actually fully control it. And, I know you work a lot with people on relationships. And the need to control is probably one of the most damaging things that can happen to a relationship, right? Because we have such intimate contact with our partner, for example. We see them all the time. We want things from them, and because we have this partial control or this partial ability to control it, we kind of keep going too far sometimes. And so one helpful technique for this, right, is to take something that you really want, that's you only have partial control of, and redefine it in terms of what aspects you actually have control of. So let's give an example. Say, like in a relationship. In a relationship, you want, apropos to your talks, more intimacy, right? Um, if you set as your goal, we are gonna achieve more intimacy, you're actually doing yourself a bit of a disservice because your mind is going to keep worrying and keep stressing about things you can't actually control, which is like, for example, the other partner's behavior, the other partner's mood, the other partner, many, many things about your other partner. But if you redefine it in terms of, I'm going to do everything in my control to enhance intimacy, right? Then you're going to have far less worry about it. And you're probably going to be more successful because you're going to be focused on yourself and what you can do rather than, like what I say is like a very natural drift people do, which is to then to kind of like restructure what other people are doing or influence what other people are doing. So the secret to, I think, that middle ground of things that we're partially in control of is redefining it back in the center. Just like if somebody was
Mm,
aiming a bow and that you could see that they're aiming off to the side, you just would kind of guide them back to the center. You want to do that with your mind, and you want to say, no, 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 I'm not going to try to control the outcome. I'm going to control the aspects that I can actually control. And
yeah.
and that's where actually, like, at the beginning of a day, I think it's really important to set like a set of intentions for your day.
Mm,
Conscious intentions, and to keep those intentions dead set in the middle of those circles, right? Of what are things
mm,
fully in my day that I can actually control? Because I think naturally what happens is that as you go through your day, your mind starts to drift to the other ones. Um, it's not that we're like power hungry or but it's just the way our mind works. It assumes every problem that comes to our
yeah.
mind we can actually control.
Hmm. Yeah. That's awesome. I was thinking while you were just talking about that, about mindfulness and how that plays into it and focusing on things that what you can control. And that's also something that, I talk to clients and patients about in terms of like coaching as well, right? Because it's all about moving forward, but it's moving forward on things that you can do and not things on what, your spouse or anyone else, because you don't have any control over that. It's only what you do that you have control over.
Absolutely, absolutely. And our mind is constantly running, and so mindfulness, in my opinion, is the ability to kind of step out of your mind and look at it, right? That's really, really important. Otherwise, you're just going to be at the mercy of the kind of state of mind you're in. And the problem with that is that,
Mm,
again, our mind by its nature tends to be protective and sometimes negative, because again, it thinks it kind of has to keep us alive. It can't distinguish between immediate threats and existential threats. So if you just go with the flow, you're often going to end up in sort of a more negative place than you need to be. And that's, I think, at the heart of what somebody says when they're anxious is that they're not trying to be anxious. They're not trying to be negative, but they're just kind of going with the flow of their mind. So I totally agree with you that
mm,
the key to mindfulness is the ability to step out of our thoughts and to actually just look at them. And
mm,
I think in our society too, we have this. Our society is very success oriented and very much
yeah.
about doing. And so even just to ask somebody to say, "Hey, look, spend even 5 minutes just kind of breathing and noticing your thoughts," it feels almost like unproductive to them. Like, wait, why would I do that? That's what's the point of these things? But the point is, like you were saying, is the ability to have this what I call an anchor in the river. If our mind is like a river that's constantly flowing, you don't want to be just swept along with it. You want to have the ability to put down an anchor and stop and decide for yourself which way you want to go in your day. So yeah, I
Yeah.
agree. Mindfulness is at the key, is at the heart of it.
Yeah. I love the analogies. I love the analogy of the anchor, and the river flowing. I mean, that oftentimes that's what happens, right? You're just when you get upset or angry or something like that, you just, let your mind and your feelings take over without really thinking about what's happening and trying to, extricate yourself from the situation, and really just looking at it objectively. And I guess that's where the emotional intelligence comes in, right? Is learning to be a little bit more objective and learning to manage your feelings and your thoughts and things like that. Um, it's really interesting. Would you say that in overcoming issues with anxiety, that you use a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy for patients when you do that?
Yeah. So, cognitive behavioral therapy is probably one of the best studied approaches. And it's actually kind of a remnant of an old philosophy called Stoicism. Um, and
Mm,
Stoics, were philosophers so Greek philosophers. There's many. One of my favorites was Seneca, and he said a very interesting thing. He said that we suffer much more in imagination than we do in
mm,
reality, right? And I think that
wow.
that's part of any kind of good any kind of good anxiety treatment is recognizing that yes, there are definitely things in this world that are real, that are actually happening, that make us suffer. There's no escaping that. But that most of the suffering we have are actually is our minds looking, dreading something ahead, right? Or regretting something in the past, right? Most of the things that make us suffer
Mm,
are actually self-created. And the liberating part about it is if we can, like you said, develop mindfulness, the ability to select our thoughts, not just follow them along blindly, we can get rid of a good part of our suffering, the unnecessary parts of our suffering. Um, there was an old book like in the 70s and 80s called, Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. And it's basically the same idea is that, yes, there are some things that we definitely need to think about and plan for. But that's different from worrying, and we can get into that in a second. The difference between planning and worrying, because that's another really good tool. But yeah, cognitive therapy is kind of a extension of that. It basically looks at what are our, when we're anxious or let's say upset, depressed, what are the thoughts that cause it? And the idea is that thoughts lead to feelings, and then feelings lead to behaviors. Really common one is that let's say I'm feeling kind of down in the morning, and I start the day and I say like, today's not going to go well. Well, that's going to read if I believe that I don't try to challenge that. I just accept it. Yep, today's not going to go well. Well, then I'm already kind of down. That makes me feel sad, and it's going to make it hard for me to get up out of bed. And so I'm going to take a longer time doing that. And then as I'm more sedentary, what's going to happen? I'm going to feel worse. I'm going to have more thoughts like that. So it's a vicious cycle. So cognitive therapy is looking at the connection between thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And the interesting thing is that when you do that, you'll find that most of your anxiety and depression, it's not like a million different thoughts that are causing it. It's usually about five or six common negative repeating thoughts. Uh, they could be self thoughts like, oh, people just don't like me, right? Or they could be about the future. Things aren't going to turn out well for me. Um, or they could be about the past. People always have hurt me. There are a lot of ways it can go. But in cognitive therapy, what you do is you find the five or six most repetitive and destructive comments that come into your brain. And then you do an interesting process with your therapist. Um, you explore it and you kind of look at the validity to it. You don't just take it at face value. Keep in mind that when we are doing this, when we're thinking negative thoughts, we're doing it in the kind of silence of our own mind. There's nobody to kind of like have an objective opinion about it. We just kind of assume it's correct and we just feel worse and worse. And it happens within seconds. It happens very fast. So in cognitive therapy, what's nice is that you take the same thought that happens in a millisecond, you say it out loud, and often even just saying it out loud, you're like you kind of like, wait, that doesn't make real sense. Um, and let's take a common one. Let's take a common example of something that would make somebody anxious, and that would be like, things aren't going to go well today, right? So you say that out loud. Okay, so that idea that things aren't going to go well today, let's look at that logically. So first, what's the most logical thing to ask about that? Well, how do you know? Like, do you have like some crystal ball, right? That's called fortune telling. If you have that ability, please let me know. There's a lot of questions I'd love to ask you, right? It's like not to know the future, right? Um, and then you do different techniques. Like one technique is a very simple one called the double standard technique. And you ask yourself that comment that you just made that made you feel real nervous that things aren't going to go well today. Would you ever say that to another friend of yours? Like if a friend was kind of looking a little nervous, would you kind of say, tap them on the shoulder and say, "Hey, by the way, I noticed you're feeling a little nervous. Things probably are not going to work out well today." And it's ridiculous, of course, right? Of course, we wouldn't be friends for very long, right? Um, but that's despite it being ridiculous, we often say these things to ourselves. So the process of cognitive therapy is to actually kind of discredit some of these thoughts that
Mm,
seem so dogmatic and truthful. And if you do that repetitively enough, and they give you little homework assignments on how to try to replace those negative thoughts with more balanced thoughts, something you actually would say to a friend. So if I saw you, you're looking nervous, I wouldn't tell you, what, your day's going to go terrible. I'd say, don't worry, just take it one step at a time, right? Just do the best you can, something like that. It's the words that we need to hear, and often people they can say it to others just fine, so they have it inside their head. But in this habit that we've developed, we don't say it to ourselves, the words we need to hear. And so cognitive therapy is
yeah.
about developing that skill of saying the words you need to hear at critical times in your day so you can soften moods and you
Mm,
can avoid going into spirals.
mm,
So that's kind of the essence of it.
yeah. That's awesome. That's good to know, how we can how we have so much control over our own thoughts, and just to try to be mindful of that so that you don't make your own situation worse, right? And how you can help yourself. So that's, yeah, those are great tips on how you can do that.
Absolutely. And just one last thing I'll say in terms of relationships. So, the more successful you feel in being able to kind of be there for yourself, it kind
Yeah.
of it lightens the load in relationships. Sometimes relationships
Mm,
get too heavy in terms of people's dependence on each other, and then people often then become resentful that the other person isn't sort of solving my problems or meeting my needs. So the more we can, each person individually and separately can feel successful in managing their own thoughts and in their own moods, it lightens the load in a relationship. So we can enjoy one another rather than have like a sort of like an unhealthy dependency on one another.
mm,
So yeah, so what's good for us is what's good for the relationship too.
yeah. It's good to know. Actually, I it's so interesting you bring that up, because I realize that, oftentimes we will, perhaps we depend on our spouse to fix all of our problems, or to make us feel better, or to do something, whatever. And instead of doing that, after just listening to you, it makes me realize that it's really just up to us, right? To kind of go through what we're feeling and go through our thoughts, and then see whether or not those thoughts are serving us. And if they're not, then, how can we change that so that those thoughts do serve us, right? And not depend on our spouse to solve all of our problems, right? You can't have your spouse, working and then helping with the kids and then, doing the outside work and then doing the barbecuing and doing this and that. And then, but then also, you have to be asking them to be present and solve all of your emotional issues and all of your work issues and all, right? Just what you're saying, that's a lot and does make relationships very heavy that way and makes it difficult.
Absolutely. And don't get me wrong, obviously as spouses, we're going to help each other out in many different ways, but responsibilities for our feelings really should rely
Mm.
on ourselves, right? Um,
Uh,
Behavior, yeah, we don't want our spouse to be harmful in their behavior. We want them to be helpful in their behavior. But responsibility for feelings, like through these, like cognitive therapy, mindfulness, it can really feel very liberating. Like, yeah, I can manage these things, and that lessens the load for your spouse. It keeps things at an appropriate kind of healthy lightness, if you will.
mm, yeah, no, that's so good. That's very good. So, any parting thoughts that you'd like to leave for our listeners or our viewers in terms of key things that they would want to do to begin the process of managing their anxiety?
Yeah, just focus on what you can actually control. I'd say, and if I were to say what we were talking about today in a nutshell, take a look at that. Where does your
Yeah.
mind go to? Is it on stuff you can control or whether it's stuff you cannot? And then, try that visual. And when you're noticing you're thinking, worrying about things a lot, see which category it is and then solve it according to, what we talked about earlier.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for your time and your expertise. And I think that these were really great, ways that we can help manage ourselves in terms of our feelings and hopefully start the process of managing anxiety and especially, how it manifests in relationships. So thanks so much. Thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Take good care.
Thanks. And so we are done here. It's been real and really intimate. And remember that this is not meant to be any type of medical advice. So if you are having any issues with anxiety, please see or speak with a psychiatrist and or a therapist to help manage your anxiety. And until next time, this is the Muslim Sex Podcast. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to schedule a one-on-one coaching with Dr. Lodhi, please visit drsadaf.com. And until next time, this is the Muslim Sex Podcast.